Today we shall be talking about welfare development. Now, the first question that comes to mind is how to define development and how did this concept arise in the course of social history. Earlier, most societies considered society to be a divine creation. In that sense, there was no issue about development as such. Everything was seen as divinely ordained, as God given, and whatever changes were taking place were due to divine intervention only. It was only during the European Renaissance, during the 16th and 17th century, that a concept of human agency in the development of society, in the origin and evolution of society was being realized. And it is at this time that the European social philosophers such as Comte, Spencer, Hegel and others started reflecting on the notion of evolution of human societies, and it was always seen as progressive, because they could not conceive that human societies were degenerative, because what they realized from whatever evidence was there from the old Stone Age to the the entire prehistoric phase to the concept of civilization, urban civilizations, the river valley, the development of urban life on the river valleys, and so on and so forth, till what they considered the arrival of the peak of human civilization. And the peak of human civilization was seen as manifested in the European countries of that time. And therefore, it was seen as a stage by stage progress, movement towards betterment. So, when the concept of development came, which arose out of the concept of social evolution, the first question that how to define development, what is development? This was entirely done keeping in mind the European civilizations as the ideal stage. So, in other words, when there was any reflection on development of any society, the ideal was that they should develop towards or strive to develop, or effort should be made to develop them towards this ideal stage of European societies of that time, and not only in terms of social, but also economic, political and religious dimensions as well. Therefore, the entire colonial period was devoted to developing the colonies, developing the native societies that the Europeans came in contact with. Those whom they thought completely subhuman, they practically eliminated, or there was genocide. And in the relatively better developed societies, which seemed to them like civilizations similar to their own, specifically say India, then there the question was of administration and to some extent development. In the post-colonial period, development has become a buzzword. It is a word that we hear all the time, and this is a word, a concept that entered into all the erstwhile colonies, because during the colonial period most of them had suffered severe losses in their economy, in their natural resources. In other words, and all that while their resources were being exploited and transferred to those societies that in the post-world period became what we today recognize as the first world countries. The first worlds became first world because they had taken away the resources from the rest of the world, who were then reduced to being the third world. So, for the main problem before the builders of these third world countries like in India, when they were left with the shattered and impoverished country in their hands once the colonial rulers had left, their goal was to somehow bring up the standards of this country to that of the first world. Now, again, since the first world was already powerful, the developmental model remained the same. That is, the third world countries aspired to develop to the whatever standards were set by the first world countries. And these standards were largely measured in economic terms, in material terms, in terms of economic growth, in terms of increase of capital, in terms of increasing the reserves in the banks, how much reserve you have in the, because when, for example, if we just take India, when the British left, they left a country with nothing. We were on the verge, so many people were starving, there was not enough food, there was not enough industries, there was in fact very little left. So, there was this movement even during the nationalist period, even during the Gandhian movement, industrialists and entrepreneurs entered the nationalist stream in order to build, as they said, a new India, a developmental process which focused on mining, on building factories like the Tata factories at Jamshedpur Steel. Then there was efforts to build up the coal industries, there were efforts to build up the all kinds of aluminium, manufacturing, cars, everything had to be done, and this was being done. But what happened as a result? Ultimately, all these efforts, which were fairly fruitful, it had a greater impact on the environment, because during the colonial period the environment had already been depleted, there was already deforestation, there was already pollution, there was already a lot of impoverishment of the rural areas. And although Mahatma Gandhi had proposed that we should start developing from the bottom, that is start dealing with the most impoverished, the most backward people first, but in their aim to catch up with the first world, the rulers of the third world could not do it. They could not do it politically, because that would have made created a project that would have been impractical, because then they would lose out even more in this neoliberal race towards capitalist accumulation that had become a necessity in the post World War situation. But ultimately it led to global environmental issues, issues that we are facing even today. So, finally, by the 70s, some major transformations started to take place in the global environment. Of these, one of the most shattering was the discovery that the ozone layer was being depleted, leading to what we today recognize as climate change, an increase in the ultraviolet rays reaching the earth with disastrous effect on human beings, on non-human beings, on the environment and so on. And it was seen as an effect of massive industrialization, because of all that there was being released into the environment as a process of unchecked industrialization, as a result of unchecked mining, deforestation. The forests that are the major carbon sink for the world which actually save the world, which purify the air, which help us breathe, they were being destroyed at a very fast rate. So now, with this realization, policies needed to be changed, and one of the major changes in policy was that you cannot have development that is centered in only one place. So that if the first world countries were developing, that is what they thought, that we can develop at the expense of the third world. So even in the post-colonial period, in the period that we call as neo-colonization, there were things that were happening, like garbage from the first world was dumped on the shores of the third world countries. Hazardous industries, like we all know about the Bhopal industry, Bhopal tragedy, hazardous industries were transferred to the third world. Resources were still being exploited from the third world, like the Amazonian rainforest, we still know is being cut at a very enormous pace. We know that the entire rainforests of Malaysia, Borneo, Indonesia have almost completely been destroyed in order to feed this industrialization and this so-called development. But then it was also realized that all the coveted resources, such as the remaining rainforests of the earth, the remaining minerals of the earth, the remaining coal and petroleum reserves, were practically all still lying in the third world countries, because the first world countries had already used up all their resources in the race for industrialization and capitalist gain. So then the only solution to saving the earth lay in stopping development in the third world countries, that is, to stop them from cutting their forests any further, stop them from destroying the environment any further. But then the third world countries started protesting. They said that we also need to develop, we need to come up to the standards, we need to raise the standard of living of our people, we need to compete with the first world countries and not be forever known as third world. So some kind of stopgap arrangements were made, such as the carbon credits, as thought up by John McCain and his colleagues. So it was said that if you save your environment, if you save your carbon imprint, that is the carbon impact, the amount of carbon that you are releasing in the environment, then you will get credits, you will get money for it. Well, it was some kind of an arrangement which still is going on, but it was not enough, because the carbon credits were not enough to stop the third world countries. And as we know, even as of today, the Amazonian rainforest is being depleted at a very high rate, at a very dangerous rate. It is not possible to stop it, because the Brazilian government does not want to. But from the late 1920s towards the end of the 1920s, there has been a shift in the perception of development. From the earlier economic and purely materialistic goals of environment, that is, creation of more resources, creation of more money, creation of more reserves of cash in the government coffers, the goal is now changing towards a more holistic model of development. Not only is development seen as something global, in the sense that it is increasingly be realized that one part cannot develop at the expense of the other. All have to develop together, all have to support each other in this development in whatever way we conceive of it, and it has to be conceived more holistically as a quality of life. And how do we define this quality of life? Power holders in most parts of the world are still defining quality of life in terms of the Western model. The quality of life that was the Gandhian quality of life has not yet been accepted, not even in India. But criticisms and protests have now started coming up, not from the top but from the bottom, and those people, those communities who have been continuously from the time development started, industrial development started to the present day, been the victims of development. Because wherever mining has taken place, wherever deforestation has taken place, wherever industries have been built, it has impacted the local communities negatively. Rivers have become polluted, air has become polluted, diseases have been introduced into the ecosystem, and the quality of life of the people have suffered very badly. And there has been a lot of literature which has depicted this. For example, the Rachel Carson's book describing the effects of DDT, which led actually to its ban, first in the first world countries and now generally all over the world. So, Silent Spring, a book which was a bestseller, Silent Spring was one of those motivators which affected a large part of the world, who started to realize that what are we doing? So, what was this negative side of development that was now increasingly coming up? The displacements, the destruction and exploitation of local communities, indigenous communities, tribal communities all over the world suffered very, very badly. Secondly, there was just one monolithic vision of a good life that was forced on everyone from the top, and that was westernization. So, you don't live in hut, you live in houses. You don't wear your original clothes, or you don't go around wearing what was considered as uncivilized dresses, but put on western clothes, put on clothes like the dominant majority, and also live like them. Go to school, get a job, don't live in the forest, don't hunt, don't do shifting cultivation, don't do pastoral economy, do farming instead, do commercial farming instead, and all this did not go down very well. A majority of people then began to protest, and also not only the people's lives were being affected, actually with the serious damage being done to the environment. Very soon, by the 21st century, we have realized that the entire globe is being affected. Today, we are facing the consequences of what we call as climate change, and we are being faced with one after the other environmental disasters. Every day on TV, on news, we see volcanoes erupting, unprecedented storms coming, unprecedented floods, areas which have never seen floods are being flooded, areas that have never been hit by storms are being hit by storms, areas that were very cold are becoming very hot. So, this aspect along with the protest from the grassroots has both affected the conception of development. In India, we had many such movements, the Narmada Bachao movement, the Tehri Dam movement, and many of them have had serious political consequences, because in a democracy, if people are unhappy, then it affects the people who are in power. So, when such consequences have begun to happen, then only those who are in power have started to rethink. They did not start to rethink as long as they were not being affected. So, the concept of sustainable development, this is now a paradigm shift from the economic development that was raging from the middle of the 20th century to the end of the 20th century. Sustainable development was forged from the 90s, the 1990s, and there were many conferences, many summits, including the various UN agencies that became concerned both with the environmental as well as the political dimensions of development. Resource conflicts. This is one of the major concerns of the 21st century. It is said that if in 21st century there is going to be another world war, it will be over water, because water is one of the fast depleting resources of the world, and water is something without which we cannot live. So now finally there is a realization that people cannot live by money alone. Wealth itself is not a solution. What we need is a more holistic, a more sustainable focus on development. So now we are moving towards what we call as green technology, towards industrial development which is environmentally sustainable. Every country possibly has, most countries at least, some kind of environmental rules and regulations in place. In 1992, the Rio de Janeiro summit, the Earth Summit on Environment and Development, called for a massive transformation in the attitude towards development. The attitude towards development was transformed towards what we call as the underlying social and political dimensions of economic development. More production was not the solution. The solution was to preserve or use renewable resources. So green technology meant that rather than keeping on mining and taking ready-made oil from inside the earth, we should focus on those resources that are not going to be depleted, they will not finish, like for example the suns, the energy from the sun. So alternative forms of energy. What are the alternative forms of energy that we can sustain? In addition to that, apart from just increasing or transforming technology or harnessing alternative forms of energy, there was also a refocusing on those dimensions of life that had been left behind during the industrial development from the time of the Industrial Revolution. For example, the millennium goals that have been developed today include various aspects of human life: culture, livelihood, quality of life that is based on cultural perceptions. There is now a lot of going back to indigenous systems of wisdom, indigenous ways of life that had at one time been trashed as uncivilized or primitive. Today people are realizing that too much consumption or a market driven economy, a consumption driven economy, way of life is not sustainable. We should not keep on thinking how much more we can consume, what different things we can consume, but rather how we can cut down on consumption, how we can preserve more, how we can recycle. Now nobody talked of recycle. Today recycle has become a buzzword. Everything needs to be recycled. Why? We cannot use and throw. We finally have come to the realization that there is not enough to be used and thrown. And again, a very important dimension, development cannot be focused on humans alone. This earth does not belong to humans, only to humans. It belongs to every living creature that exists on this earth. And every living creature is required for humans to live. We don't live in isolation on this earth. What we live in is an ecosystem. So, biodiversity and its maintenance has now become a key dimension of development. Today, nobody talks of just development, everybody talks of sustainable development. Nobody talks of just extraction of resources, we talk of renewable resources, we talk of conservation, we talk of preservation. And as far as human societies are concerned, there is increasing realization that poverty and inequality incompatible with development of any kind. Then again, peace. If we really want to live in a sustainable world, if we really want to not destroy the world in which we are living, peace is very important, because all kinds of war and conflict place a huge cost on the environment. Years of building up an environment can be destroyed within few minutes, like what America did in Vietnam. They dropped napalm bombs on them because it was an agricultural economy and they wanted to destroy their resource base, and napalm bombs completely destroyed the fertility of the earth. This kind of action, which causes long term damage to the environment, is usually happens during wartime. You drop one atomic bomb, or even because there is a possibility of an atomic warfare, most people have some kind of an atomic installation, and look what happened in Fukushima. The leakage, the involuntary, the inadvertent leakage has actually probably caused environmental damage globally. It is not being talked about, but most people understand that. So, development as we need to understand it today, a welfare development, a development that is not destructive, a development that is not degenerative, a development that is not directed towards the annihilation of humankind, needs to sustain the entire earth, needs to sustain all forms of life, not just human. It needs to be democratic, it needs to take everybody along. Like our Prime Minister has given the slogan Sabka Saath Sabka Vikas. Actually, that is the right spirit, whether it is implemented or not implemented, but the buzzword should be like that. You cannot develop alone, you cannot go on that path alone, you have to take everybody along with you. It has to be holistic. As long as inequalities remain, as long as there are marginalized communities, we cannot talk of a developed world, we cannot talk of a developed globe, a globe where life is being sustained. So, it is life sustenance that should be the underlying goal and principle of development as we need to understand it today.